Good afternoon and welcome to the Copernicus Climate Change and Atmosphere Monitoring Press Briefing on the Climate Summary of 2021. My name is Dr. Samantha Burgess and I am Deputy Director of the Copernicus Climate Change Service, or C3S, and your moderator for this afternoon's webinar. Before we get started, some quick housekeeping information. This is a Zoom webinar. In case you run into any technical difficulties, please reach out to the technical support or Copernicus press team. We're recording this webinar. However, no personal information will be displayed. The presentation will be made publicly available, but the Q&A will not be, to comply with GDPR rules. I would now like to introduce Mario Facchini, the Head of Unit for Earth Observation for DEFIS, to give some opening words.
Thank you very much, Samantha, and thank you very much for inviting me to this meeting. I'm very happy to give some introductory words. So first of all, good afternoon to everyone. And before entering into the real topic of today, so climate change, atmosphere, and so on, please let me recall a bit of the overall context. So with the approval in 2021 of an EU budget of 5.4 billion euros for Copernicus, the EU Earth Observation Programme is operational and ensure until 2028. We will continue to trust and count on the technical excellence of ECMWF to run measurements, notably linked to the atmosphere quality and to climate change. We acknowledge the excellent work done by ECMWF in running this part of the Copernicus program until now, and we count on them for a continued provision of information. Why an EU program like Copernicus is investing so much in monitoring climate change and atmosphere? The EU is currently working to build a greener, more digital and more resilient Europe. The Copernicus program, and in particular its environmental part, constitutes an important tool to implement the Union's Green Deal policies as one of the von der Leyen Commission's priorities. The Green Deal policies address a number of policy areas aimed at increasing the sustainability of human activities and the healthiness of our environment, areas like biodiversity, farm to fork, sustainable finance, sustainable industry, mobility, zero pollution, and so on and so on. Almost all these policy areas affect or are affected by climate change. So this is clearly one of the key policies in the Green Deal package. Without understanding how our climate is changing and the risk that these changes will bring, we cannot plan for a climate resilient future. The 2021 climate analysis released today shows that globally the warmest years ever recorded were in the last 7 years. 2021 was the 5th warmest year on record, with emissions continuing to increase. The urgency of climate action has never been more important. The Copernicus Climate and Atmosphere Monitoring Services, called C3S and CAMS, already support Europe's climate efforts by providing data and information that underpin climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. C3S gives access to state-of-the-art reanalysis products, which combine millions of in situ and satellite observations with model outputs to produce maps without gaps, able to describe the state of the atmosphere and the ocean for every place on the planet at any hour from 1950 to present. Both C3S and CAMS contribute to the body of evidence that informs important publications for policymakers, such as the latest IPCC assessment reports. Thanks to the Copernicus free and open data access policy, anyone can make use of the Copernicus satellite and in situ observations, models, and other products about past, present, and future climate and transform it into useful insights for climate resilience. Users from all over the world do exactly that via the Copernicus Climate and Atmosphere data stores. All European countries need to drive down carbon emissions, and this is an undeniably tough undertaking. But data from the Copernicus services, such as C3S and CAMS, funded by the EU, can play an important role to inform mitigation efforts and demonstrate progress towards net zero. Beyond the continuation of the measurements of current parameters, the Copernicus program is planning to evolve with the possibility to observe CO2 anthropogenic emissions. To this end, Copernicus will deploy new satellites for CO2 observations and the corresponding modeling capacities that will be the first worldwide to monitor man-made CO2 emissions in support of the UNFCCC climate agreement. And with this, I hand back to you, Samantha, and ECMWF colleagues for more details on the 2021 results of C3S. Thank you.
Thank you, Mauro. I would now like to introduce Dr. Freya Vanborg, a senior scientist at C3S, to introduce the main findings of the 2021 climate summary.
Yes, thank you, and hello everyone. I will start by sharing my screen. Sam, can you please confirm that you see the presentation?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. So again, welcome to everyone. This will be a brief overview of the Copernicus 2021 annual summary, which has been put together by the Copernicus Climate Change Service and the Atmosphere Monitoring Services. So we'll start with some of the kind of key highlights of last year. So if we look at temperatures for the globe, as already stated, the 7 last years were the warmest on record. And among those, 2021 ranks as one of the cooler. In our data set, it's 5th, but it's only marginally warmer than 2015 and 2018. If we look to Europe, which is one of our main regions for monitoring, it was just above the 1991 to 2020 average and outside the warmest 10 years on record. But with that, one should remember that the last 30 years, which is our new reference period, already contain a large amount of warming since the pre-industrial. And even though maybe the year as a whole wasn't that remarkable, the summer was the warmest summer in Europe on record for Europe, with quite an intense heat wave in the Mediterranean region during late July, early August, when a new maximum temperature record was likely reached in Sicily of 48.8 degrees Celsius. So this record is still to be confirmed by the World Meteorological Organization, so such is not yet a complete official record compared to the record before, which was 0.8 degrees cooler. And coming back to the global level, concentrations of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane have continued to rise during 2021, and especially the growth rate during 2021 for methane was particularly high, which was also the case actually for the year prior to that, so 2020. And I will go into a little bit more detail and also some explanations behind the findings. And we'll start with greenhouse gases and atmospheric carbon dioxide. And what you see here is measurements derived from satellites. So it's important to note that whilst satellite measurements of carbon dioxide and methane are comparable to those measurements that one might be more familiar with at the surface, there is a slight difference in the actual values, just simply because the satellite measurements take into account the whole atmospheric column, so from the surface up until the top of the atmosphere and the concentrations within those, whereas of course surface measurements are exactly that, measurements at the surface. But what you see at the top curve is the concentrations, and you see the typical kind of seasonal variability within each year, with CO2 concentrations generally peaking during springtime, boreal springtime. And as you can see, these have been continued to grow during last year. And looking then at the bottom graph, where we see the growth rate, so by how much did the concentrations grow within that year, we see that the level lies, based on this preliminary analysis, on around 2.4 ppm per year, which is quite similar to what was seen in 2020 as well, and also kind of quite close to the general average for the last decade or so, but a lot lower, for instance, than the growth rates during 2015 and 2016. If we then go to methane, it's the same type of, well, same idea. Also measurements from satellites. At the top, you see the concentrations and how they've grown over the last year. And again, in the bottom graphic, the growth rate for methane. And there you can see that compared to the last 2 decades or so, the growth rates of the last two years have been relatively high. These are, of course, still preliminary numbers, but they're also corroborated by other preliminary numbers for 2021. But there is still quite a big scientific discussion of why those rates have been so high. And this is an ongoing analysis, mainly due to the fact that the range of sources for methane is very large, and there are both human and natural sources of methane, and to disentangle that, it requires further analysis. If we then move on to surface air temperatures for the globe, I just wanted to show this time series which shows the increase in temperature over the last 40 years or so. And what you can see on the left-hand axis is the increase above the 1850 to 1900 reference level. So what is the period which is typically referred to as the pre-industrial. And 2021 was around 1.1 to 1.2 degrees above that level. On the right-hand side of this graphic, you also see the global temperature in relation to the latest 30-year period. And there you can clearly see that the last 30 years, they were well above the pre-industrial temperature, as we all know, with global warming, around 0.9 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial. And I think that's important to keep in mind for the remainder of what we're going to see. But what I also want to point out is the red bars represent the data set that we are producing and upon which these figures are based. But of course, there are other data sets for global temperature, and which as a key variable is important to also keep those other data sets in mind, which is why we decided to show them here. So you can see these little dots kind of indicate the typical spread between these data sets. And that's also why we think that even though with this data set, 2021 ranks 5th, it's quite likely that it will have another rank, but possibly 6th or 7th in other data sets, but that still remains to be seen. Now moving on to the next picture, I wanted to remember this right-hand side graphic of the temperature relative to 1991 to 2020, because we look at the year as a whole of the globe compared to that reference period. We can see that some regions, those in red, were warmer than that average, and some regions were cooler than that average. Those are the blue ones. So the ones to maybe point out in terms of being specifically warm was the parts of US and Canada, but especially the northeast of Canada and Greenland, also some regions over Africa and the Middle East. Whereas if we look at below average temperatures, some of the ones with the largest, what we call anomalies, so differences from the average, were across easternmost Russia and Alaska, also parts of Western Siberia, and also parts of Antarctica. And of course, also in the central Eastern Pacific, due to the waning La Nina that started in 2020, so at the start of 2021, and the re-emergence of a La Nina later in the year. Now, just to mention a number of key events of 2021, this is by no means an exhaustive list, but mainly focuses on those events that we have highlighted or especially looked at during 2021 in terms of temperature, other climates, and also fire monitoring from the Copernicus atmosphere monitoring service. So one really of the kind of key events of last year was the exceptional heat wave in the US. and Canada, so in northwestern North America during June, where temperature records were broken by quite some degrees. It also resulted in the warmest June on record for the whole of North America, and the hot but also very dry conditions that kind of persisted throughout a lot of the year, so the dry conditions into summer and during summer, of course, exacerbated the wildfire season with quite a number of intense wildfires in the region during summer. Wildfires in general, where they were the most, say, extreme, were in parts of Siberia, with some regions seeing record-breaking amounts of carbon emissions from wildfires. So this is one way of measuring wildfire activity. And then we focus on Europe. One notable event was the late season frosts in Western Europe. So this might not seem like such a notable event, but what happened was that in parts of Europe, March was relatively warm. So to have this late season frost meant that quite a lot of agricultural produce that had started its growing season then was heavily affected. In July, there was, of course, the very heavy rainfall and flooding event in Central Europe. So with heavy rainfall falling on already saturated soils in parts, and leading to really devastating flooding in Central Europe. And then finally, what I mentioned also at the beginning, is an extreme heat wave during July and August in the Mediterranean region, where there was a likely new European maximum temperature record of 48.8 degrees Celsius. And also here, the dry and hot conditions were conducive to a very active wildfire season across the Mediterranean region. And that's all I wanted to highlight in this very brief presentation, and we're ready to take your questions. And I just want to leave you with some links, so to the press kit, where you can find a lot of additional information about how the data set were put together, also all the graphics, etc., in high resolution, and other materials such as videos and so on. If you should have any press inquiries after this briefing, then please contact Copernicus-press@ecmwf.int. And here are a number of other useful links that you might want to consult either today or in following our activities in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Freya. We will now move into the question and answer session. And I see that some of you have already found the Q&A feature of this webinar. Please type your questions in the Q&A mask and indicate if you would like to ask your questions directly. If you do want to ask your questions directly, your microphone and camera will be open to enable you to do so. Otherwise, I will read out the questions and point them to the relevant panelists. Please keep any follow-up questions to a maximum of 2. I would now like to introduce our final panelists to join our other 2 speakers, Mauro and Freya. The final panelist is Dr. Vincent-Henri Puc, Director of the Copernicus Atmosphere Monitoring Service. Vincent-Henri, if you could say hello to enable people to see you, and then we'll move to the Q&A.
Hello, good morning or afternoon.
Great, thank you so much. So, and thank you, Freya, for your excellent presentation. The data that has been shown today is data from the Copernicus Climate Change and Atmosphere Monitoring Service, but obviously we engage with a very large community of scientists, both within Europe and across the globe, not least of all the European national meteorological agencies, whose data we also rely on. So in terms of the first question, this is from Marta, and apologies in advance if I mispronounce anyone's last name. So the first question is from Marta Montojo from Agencia EFE. Do you have country-specific data that we can see? For example, what was the maximum temperature registered in Spain? Which European country was most impacted by the extreme weather event impacts of 2021? Freya, that's a question for you.
Yes, thank you, Martha. So our general remit is to do monitoring for the pan-European domain, so not for nations. So this is the remit of the National Meteorological and Hydrological Service. So for Spain, that would be IAMET. Of course, in terms of the impacts, it depends on which extreme event you talk about. So the flooding, it affected many countries, but amongst those, one could say that Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg were the most heavily impacted. But there were other countries as well. And for the heat wave, of course, the record was set in Sicily, but also Greece and Spain saw very high temperatures during that heat wave.
Thank you, Freya. The next question is from Ursula Kaczorowska. What does it mean, the warmest on record? Do you mean records done by your institution? When did it start? Or records generally? Another one for Freya.
Yeah, so it depends on the exact quantity we're looking at. So if we talk about temperatures, for instance, our records go back to 1950, but we then combine them with other records that go back to about 1850. So as I showed in the temperature time series for the globe, for instance, and by kind of merging these data sets on record for the globe in Europe mean, especially for warm records, that we go back to 1850. And when it comes to greenhouse gas concentrations, we know that prior to those measurements where the satellites started, there weren't any time when the greenhouse gases were as high during human occupation of Earth, so to say. And as such, any record within the latest time series also de facto becomes a record for very long back in time.
Thank you, Freya. There are now two questions from Teresa. I'm not sure of your affiliation. The first one is for Freya. Is the cooling of Europe accidental, or is there an underlying trend, for example, Gulf Stream weakening? And then there's a follow-up question for Vincent and Henri.
Well, so I wouldn't say there's a cooling for Europe. So Europe last year was still just about above the average of the last 30 years. And those 30 years were much warmer than the average during pre-industrial times. So this is just part of natural climate variability, that above this warming trend, you will also have some years which are slightly cooler or slightly warmer than others. The specific reason for why it was slightly cooler last year is something that still would need to be investigated. And actually, you probably couldn't answer it, even after analysis, exactly what are the driving reasons behind it.
Great, thank you. And the follow-up question is, do you have any idea about the reason for the methane emission increase, permafrost thawing because of the wildfires in Siberia?
Yes, I would say we have hypotheses, not ideas, or certainly not certainties about these recent methane increase trends. In terms of methane, the sources of methane are varied and complex. So it's really a challenge for the science community as a whole to identify which of the sources may be driving this trend. My personal feeling is permafrost thawing is not the most likely candidate for such a change in a matter of a couple of years from a rate which was average to something that has probably doubled. As far as we understand, the permafrost thawing would be something more gradual. And if you look also at the temperature anomalies over Siberia, you have really two different regions. Some regions which were below temperature in the west part of Siberia and southern part of Siberia, while it was really exceptionally hot and with a high number of wildfires in the north and east, and particularly the Sakha Republic. So I wouldn't say permafrost thawing is the most likely candidate, but also I think it's a big challenge for the scientific community to identify the reasons, probably the reasons why this exceptionally high number for methane.
Thank you, Vincent-Henri. I see the next couple of questions are asking for a copy of the presentation, so please send your inquiries to Copernicus Press, and both the presentation will be freely shared, and the presentation session of this webinar will also be available on YouTube, and the link will be sent around to everyone attending the seminar. The next question is from David Renke, saying, thank you for the presentation. Is there an explanation for the exceptional high CO2 growth rate in 2015? To Vincent-Henri.
Yes, I think the scientific community attributes the high growth rate in 2015 and 16 actually to the El Nino event and the connection with large wildfires. There were extraordinary fires in Indonesia, in particular in late 2015. So yes, so definitely for these extreme high CO2 growth rate that was probably connected to the El Nino event.
Thank you. And a follow-up question for you. How worrying do you find the latest increase in methane concentrations?
It's very hard to answer. Of course, methane together with CO2 is a very potent greenhouse gas. So it's a concern to see the atmospheric rate double compared to the average. Maybe it's just part of variability, but certainly science is needed to see whether it's something part of the variability, possibly natural variability, or if it's something that is linked to the more recent trends and anthropogenic effect to climate change. So I think it's worrying, principally because it's high and we don't know exactly well what is the reason behind.
Thank you, Vincent-Henri. There's also a follow-up question, but I think you've already answered it. What the possible explanations are for the increase in methane for the last 2 years?
Yeah, yes, it was basically the first question. We don't know very well. Just to add, so methane has a number of sources. Some are natural, like wetlands. Some are anthropogenic, like use of energy, like agriculture, which are the two biggest sources, but also something that can modulate the accumulation of methane in the atmosphere is the destruction of methane in the atmosphere. So the it's a chemical destruction of methane, and the capacity of the atmosphere to oxidize methane may be changing. So all of these are candidates for being reasons. So the strength of the chemical sink in the atmosphere, and also the strength of the different sources of methane.
Thank you. The next question is from Kate Abnett from Reuters. It is a surprise that 2021 was not near the top of the rankings for hottest years. Please, could you also confirm when the records date back to?
So I guess this is for me.
Sorry, Freya, yes, it is.
So I wouldn't say it's a surprise. If you look at all the last 7 years, they're not super close, but they're quite close together, and they stand kind of well off the ones that came before that. So it expected to have some level of variability from year to year. And there are different reasons for this. There are different oscillations in the system. And the records, well, I would say they date back to 1850. So.
Thank you, Freya. And so the records that we use within Copernicus are back to 1950. But the temperature records, global temperature records, go back an extra century, and we correlate with these records as well. The next question is also for Freya, is from Matt McGrath from BBC News. Was 2021 the warmest La Nina year? Are these naturally cooling events being overwhelmed by anthropogenic warming?
So no, because 2020 was a La Nina year as well. So actually, if you compare 2020 and 2021 anomalies over the Eastern Pacific, they are not that different from each other. So where that in 2020, for instance, there was a really, really large anomaly across the Arctic for large parts of the year, which is kind of one of the reasons why 2020, let's say, is warmer than 2021. And of course, you have these natural variations, say the El Niños, La Niñas, which modulate the temperature trend, but it's not necessarily that they're being masked, it's just that they're operating at a new level on a kind of generally warmer state.
Thank you. And the next question is also for you, Freya, from Kelly Elstrom, SVT News. The heat wave this summer in the Mediterranean region, to what extent is that possible to attribute to climate change? Have any attribution studies already been done?
So there have been attribution studies done, but not by Copernicus. So I can't really comment on them in detail. Of course, in a warming climate, we are expecting to see more and more frequent, heat waves or more intense heat waves. And also there is already observational evidence that in Europe, due to the warming that's taken place already, heat waves have already become more intense. So the heat wave last summer fits into that picture, but as Copernicus, we have not done attribution studies of this yet.
Thank you. The next question is for Vincent-Henri from Michel de Moulanier from Le Soir, Brussels. It's a follow-up question about methane. Is the increase in concentrations due to an increase in natural or anthropogenic sources, and which ones? And how do you explain the much higher rates in 2021?
Yes, around the same topic. To give more background, sources of methane are approximately 40% natural and 60% anthropogenic. So there is a balance between the two. So it's very hard to say if one was overwhelming, maybe it would point to one being more susceptible of explaining the big rates that we've seen in 2020 and 2021. It's at this stage, I think it's not possible to say that which one of the anthropogenic or natural is responsible. Some are also similar. Natural, the main source are wetlands, while one of the main source of anthropogenic emission are agriculture and rice culture in particular. And it's all connected. So it's likely that it's a combination of reasons, both in terms of the sources themselves, but also in terms of the regions connecting with the anomalies that we see. But it's too early, unfortunately, to answer this question with more precision.
Thank you, Vincent-Henri. The next question is from Cristina Delia, journalist and TV producer at the Romanian National Television, Public Television. What do the data show about sea ice extent in the Arctic, for Freya?
Yes, thank you. So we're not actually covering sea ice in the annual release, but of course we monitor sea ice on a monthly basis. And sea ice during 2020, it was generally not exceptional. It was very, very low during the beginning of summer, but since then it's kind of built up again, and now it's quite far off the kind of lowest, still being below average of the last 30 years, but far off the lowest extents that have been recorded for the kind of respective months later in the year.
Thank you, Freya. So there's now a request for a question by Luca Casani. Could we get his microphone and camera open so he can answer the question directly? Or she, sorry. Luca, can you speak? No, I think it's not possible at this point, so we'll get back to you later on. So the next question is from Sir Carol. In the data you have presented, we see a steady growth of greenhouse gas emissions. Does that mean that we are yet to see any effects of various green initiatives announced in several regions around the world? From Polish radio. So Vincent-Henri.
Yes, I think it's a harsh way to say it, but it's a reality, because it's only when you look at the detail that you see, for instance, that last year with all the COVID-related measures, that emissions of CO2 seem to have reduced by maybe 5 to 7%. The difficulty in the current state is that we are looking at the emissions and the result of emissions in the atmosphere. And the anthropogenic emissions are a small fraction of the whole carbon cycle. So this small fraction is very important, because it's what is explaining the imbalance that is creating this accumulation of CO2. But also it is very difficult to disentangle the signal due to anthropogenic emissions, and whether some efforts in reducing the emissions are materialized in a context where the interannual variability of these fluxes is large. And that's where the initiative that Mauro Facchini introduced, this monitoring and verification support capacity of CO2 arrives. So we are working with the European Commission, with the European Space Agency, with EUMETSAT to develop a capacity to infer not only the CO2 emissions or their concentration in the atmosphere, but the anthropogenic CO2 emissions. With that, we will have a much better tool to see the limited efforts that are made across the world more early and more decisively that we see now, where we see aggregated figure, which have certainly the effect of the measures, but also other types of variation. So we don't see much. It's not because efforts are not there, but efforts need to be really strong to pop up in the global figure in the future. So we are speaking of 2026 for this extra capacity, with satellites being launched in 2025. We will be able to pinpoint more rapidly changes in anthropogenic emissions, and thus we'll have a better way to help the countries to see whether the measures that they are taking are really showing in reality in the atmosphere.
Thank you, Vincent-Henri. The next question is from Monica Herscher from NBC News Digital in the US. It's a question to Freya. You mentioned that other data sources might place the year's global temperature as 6th or 7th overall instead of 5th. What causes the discrepancies in different organizations' scientific rankings of each month/year's average global temperature compared to historic months and years?
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, I wouldn't call it discrepancies, but rather just differences due to different methods. And I actually think it's the strength of having these different methods and nevertheless coming up with numbers which are de facto very, very, very similar, shows that despite using independent methods, we all kind of come up with the same answer. The reason really for the rankings being so maybe potentially different is because the years themselves are very close to each other. So the difference between one year and the next is within that level of uncertainty that you expect to get from these different methods. And the reason why we have different numbers is because the Earth is not covered by temperature sensors. Rather, there are different measurements at different locations, and you use those different measurements to, via different methods, come up with a global temperature map, and based on that map, you make the global average.
Thank you, Freya. The next question is from Raymond Zong from the New York Times. How does 2021 look when compared to only other La Nina years? Was it the warmest La Nina year on record? Freya's already clarified this, that arguably 2020 was. Has Copernicus tried to quantify La Nina specific effects on global average temperatures and emissions for 2021?
So we haven't tried to quantify the effect of La Nina, but it's also quite complicated. So if you look at just the La Nina signal, for instance, between 2020 and 2021, the anomalies across the Pacific are not that different, but then equally the La Nina of 2020 persisted, in the late part of 2020 and into 2021, so there's also possible you have some lagged effects. So the La Nina of 2020 playing out a role on the surface air temperatures in other parts of the world later on, but this is not something we have investigated.
Thank you. The next question is from Peter Kupek and is to you as well, Freya. When you speak about the hottest European summer, can you specify the average temperature reached that summer? And that's from the Czech news agency.
Yeah, so when we talk about these temperatures for large regions, we tend to refer to anomalies rather than absolute